Today is Friday, November 3rd, 2017. This is Hannah Crawford. I am interviewing Dr. Walter R. Dowdle for the Global Polio Eradication Initiative History Project in the Broadcast Department of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, Georgia. Mr. Todd Jordan is our studio engineer and videographer. Dr. Dowdle served as director for the Virology Division at CDC from 1973 to 1979. Assistant Director for Science at CDC from 1979 to 1983. He served as Director for Infectious Diseases from 1980 to 1986, and he was Acting Director at CDC from 1989 to 1990. Thank you for being here. In 1994, Dr. Dowdle retired from CDC and moved over to work at the Task Force for Global Health, where he served as Director of the U.S. Poliovirus Laboratory Containment Preparedness and as Director of the Poliovirus Antiviral Drugs Initiative. You've had a very long career, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
So we'll be discussing your involvement in polio eradication, expanding the program, even before the polio eradication activity had a name here. So to begin, I'd like to record your verbal consent. Do we have your permission to interview you and record it today?
Yes, you have my permission.
Great. So if you would, introduce yourself by name, say where and when you were born, and briefly a bit about your early life and education leading you into microbiology.
Yeah, my name is Walter Reed Dowdle, and I was born on December 11th, 1930, in a small town in South Alabama. And from there, I went into the military after 1 year of college, and during the Berlin airlift and the Korean War. And then after that, I pretty much formed what I had planned on doing, and that was because I was in the medical corps during the Korean War, that thought I was more interested in patients, but I realized I was more interested in the scientific side. So when I finally was discharged from the military, then I went into school with the objective of microbiology and, of course, eventually virology. And so I pretty much followed through on my basic interest, and everything just worked out fine.
What interested you about microbiology and virology?
Well, at the time, it was really quite a lot to do. I mean, it was clearly a field where it was wide open. There was a whole lot was being done and being learned, but it was also a field that was obviously something that was exciting and much more to become in the future. And I like to tell a story that when I got here to CDC in 1960, that Alexander Langmuir, who was the epidemiologist, used to say that the only reason for the lab is for the epidemiologist to be able to confirm that they were right. And and we used to make a joke of that, but in many respects, he was correct. I mean, there was so much the laboratory couldn't do, because at that time when I first came in, we didn't know what caused the common cold. I mean, stop to think about that. Now we know, have for years now, but we didn't know, we'd never seen the measles virus. All these things were completely new. We knew a lot about polio, knew a lot about influenza, but there were many hepatitis viruses had not been isolated. None of the other the coronaviruses, the many viruses that we have here, none of those had been isolated. So you see, it was a totally open field. And so my career here at CDC, well, even beginning before that, because of the work I did at the University of Maryland and the work I did at the University of Alabama, was also an era where everything was just so exciting. Everything was happening. Tissue culture, which is the whole basis for the polio vaccine, was actually developed while I was still in graduate school. Just to think how all this was happening, all this expanding at the same time. It's extraordinary exciting times.
I remember you saying over the phone that one of the strains of virus in the vaccine was developed in Montgomery. Is that correct?
Well, that's correct. In fact, this was Montgomery. Montgomery was the site of the virology laboratory at the time CDC was formed. So in the 1950s, the virology laboratory was actually in a sort of unused Quonset huts at Maxwell Air Force Base in Montgomery. And at that time, there were a number of people back in the early 50s, there were a number of people who were working on a live polio vaccine, not just sabin. And in fact, sabin was one of many. Probably the most advanced work was done by Hillary Kapowski, who was also interested in live polio vaccines and developing strains that were actually immunized but not cause disease. And the same was true in Montgomery. The CDC laboratory there was working on strains. And in fact, the strain that was used in the trivalent, that means 3 vaccine strains in the sabin oral polio vaccine, one was the strain that was developed by the CDC laboratory in Montgomery. And so because there were so many people trying to develop strains and so many people competing, there was a meeting one time to decide which strains would be the best to go forward with. And somehow sabin strains actually were seen as probably the most reliable and the least dangerous strains to use. And one, of course, was the strain from the CDC lab, which sabin had gotten and made one or two more transformations before presenting it as a strain which should be part of the vaccine. To make a long story short, once these strains were selected, then the message went out, no more polio research by the other organizations, because you had to go forward and use your resources for developing one vaccine, and that was the sabin vaccine. So actually sabin strains came from several different places, but one being from CDC. And of course, this was in 1959. And in 1959, the CDC lab in Montgomery was, as you can say, a little devastated by having this program taken away from him. And the laboratory director at the time was Mars Schaefer, and Mars Schaefer left CDC. He became the commissioner, health commissioner of the city of New York. And the other person who was involved was C.P. Lee from Taiwan, and he went, I think, eventually back to Taiwan. And then the laboratory in 1960 moved here. So it's a very early involvement in polio.
And in 1960, you came to CDC. Did you come directly from University of Maryland?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And you walked into this milieu of opportunity in your field of study. Could you talk about when you first came here?
Well, when we first came here, the building, which of course no longer exists, but the building was so-called state of the art at its time. And the building, interestingly enough, had restrooms for white and colored. That is hard to believe, but it did. Now, the plans for these buildings were actually designed or were drawn up in the probably mid-50s, 55 or something like that. And that was standard. And when we first entered the building, I mean, everybody, said, well, even the everybody at CDC said, we can't do this. We can't do this at all. So the decision was made that all the extra restrooms that were considered to be colored restrooms were given to the women. And so this is probably one of one of the fairest
Makes sense.
decisions that have ever been made. So the women ended up with at least probably a 3-to-2 ratio over bathrooms in the building. And I thought that was remarkable. I thought it's a great place to work if you can make those types of decisions. And then we had things like rugs on the floor that were supposed to be filled with formaldehyde or some disinfectant to walk on. It was incredible that all of those have gone by the wayside and went by the wayside pretty quickly. But it still was an inadequate building for infectious diseases. And so we had problems in the building, of course, for transmission. At least we had a couple of deaths back in 1977 of Rocky Mountain spotted fever, and that's what finally sort of stimulated a little movement towards developing the laboratories and buildings that were more safety focused than we'd had before.
One follow-up question to segregated bathrooms at CDC in the 50s and 60s. Were people segregated from each other? Were people...
No.
How did it impact the working culture here?
No, in fact, not at all. I mean, the 5 years there between 50s, the early 50s, and by the time the building was actually built, I mean, and from a social standpoint, the changes were enormous. And so this was not a problem. In fact, from the beginning here, there was a real concerted effort to make sure that we were totally integrated, and a real effort to try to make sure that there was no distinction. And one of the reasons well, the big problem was that we had, for example, visitors early on from African countries and this type of thing, and finding places for them to stay right near. We finally made arrangements for certain places that we could have visitors stay. And
where were some of those places?
Well, this led, part of it led to the development of the international, trying to think of the name of it. It's right over here. It's the international house that actually serves to house visitors for both Emory and CDC.
Is it Scarborough?
No, it's right here on Clifton Road. I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of the place now, but it's still in operation. And it was actually, that's part of the reason for it to be set up, so it would be a place where you could actually house people of all races, and it would make it convenient for them to be near the CDC.
At that time, was CDC seen by other agencies as being progressive?
Well, but see, most of the agencies of this size were located in Washington. We're one of the few agencies that are outside of Washington. So they assumed that you had to at least, abide by the mores of the location. And so that's where the assumptions came from, I guess. But that was not true. I mean, CDC was quite a leader in fact, breaking down the barriers to full integration. And
that happened at an institutional level, right, with changes in the bathrooms, reassigning bathrooms to women.
Yeah.
But what about on the interpersonal?
Oh yeah, it was all through. It was no problem. Believe me, it was a wonderful place. There's never been problems like that. I mean, starting from the top, the top was very progressive, and I think most people who work in public health are, that's not an issue. I mean, in fact, it's an issue, but the other direction, So once again, it made me really proud to be, hired by an organization with this type of spirit and this type of sensitivity.
So to return to the labs, there are two different directions I have in mind right now. One is to ask you to describe the new facilities as CDC lab facilities became more safety-minded. But also I wanted to ask you about, you said over the phone in our pre-interview that you knew Salk and Sabin personally. So I wanted to find an opportunity to talk about that as well.
Well, interestingly, my direct involvement with both Salk and Sabin came not through polio, but from influenza. And at one time, for about 10 years there, I guess, I was the director of the World Health Organization International Influenza Center for the Americas. And there were two total centers. One was in Atlanta, and which we operated here, and the other one was in London, England. And between the two of us, and it's still true, but some variation, but from the two of us, we pretty well had networks out in both hemispheres. And so therefore, we had all the Americas, and the European facility in London had all of the other laboratories in the world. So that's how I first got involved in networking and setting up labs in all these different places. And so to make a long story short, when the 1976 swine flu vaccine program was finally enacted, then Sabin was one of the signatories of this inaction and encouraged Ford to actually ask Congress to fund such a program. Sabin then later changed his mind and decided that there was no evidence of virus, and so therefore he couldn't support it anymore. But that led him into other interest in influenza, and then he became convinced that influenza vaccine wasn't very effective against elderly Americans. I mean, against flu for elderly Americans. And he was absolutely right. And I didn't have a lot of complaints, but I seemed to have been the target of Sabin's target. And so I'll always remember that Sabin would call up. He had a lot of interest in this, and he was going to push this. And so he would, if he wanted something, it was always, Walt. And then if he called me up and says, Dr. Dowdle, I knew I was in trouble. I mean, so it was an amazing relationship. But actually, I really enjoyed it. We had an occasion one time where we were to debate the immunization program for elderly adults and the effectiveness and practicality and all that sort of thing. So we were scheduled for this television debate out on Long Island in New York, one of the studios in Long Island. And so the morning we were to be picked up by this limousine that we were staying in different hotels. I'm sure mine was few dollars down from his, but when we were picked up by the same limousine. So we sat in the back, and there was a snowstorm. And so it took hours and hours to get out to the Long Island studios. And during this time, we had the whole debate in the back of the limousine. By the time we got to the studios, we'd pretty much agreed on what we were going to agree on. And it was, I don't know that program ever aired. I don't think I ever saw it. There may have been parts of it, but I think it was pretty much a disaster. So that's one of the things I remember about Sabin. And there were other issues. Also, I think that in regard to Sabin and in regard to polio, that one of the most I think interesting aspects of Sabin's interest in Brazil and really pushing these eradication programs always omit the fact that his second wife was Brazilian. And she played a remarkable role, a very, very important role in his life. I mean, to see the two of them, I mean, her Albert, by Albert, she referred to him. Her Albert was, I mean, on a pedestal with her just constantly. She happened to be the daughter of the owner of what at that time was the equivalent of Time magazine in Brazil. Very powerful, very wealthy, very politically connected family. And so his sort of, insert himself in Brazil, really a lot of it was due to her. And I often thought how little credit she's gotten for it. I'm sure he wouldn't agree to that, but how little credit that she got. And then when we discovered, and Olin, when his group did the work on circulating vaccine-derived polioviruses, where the virus clearly had to come from continued circulation of the vaccine viruses, I remember specifically talking to her about it, and she said that she thought it was wrong, that we have actually, she thought, created a problem in Sabin's vaccine and its image, and she was very upset to the point that she was crying. And
where did this happen? Where did you?
He was dead. He'd already died when this came, and when I was talking to her.
But where did you see her?
I don't remember where the occasion was, but I had known her. I mean, we had crossed in different events and this type of thing, not in a social setting, unless you call those social settings. But she's a very remarkable person, and so intense, in her support of Albert and the polio program and everything else. She's quite a remarkable woman, and the fact that she was so tied in to the Brazilian political situation, then it made it also possible for Sabin to have inroads into the polio program there. And of course, that we all have to say, Brazil was the beginning of the polio eradication program.
Do you have a sense of any of the details of how that evolved?
Of the details in Brazil?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it was very, very stormy. I mean, it really quite was. It really was. They had various different starts. By the way, it had nothing to do at that time with eradication. It really had to do with just control of polio in Brazil. They tried a number of different ways for 20 years to get it to eliminate polio in Brazil, and they just couldn't. And so, to make a long story short, Sabin was pushing mass immunization. So they went to mass immunization, but it wasn't successful because they really didn't have the controls or the organization that was needed. And finally, instead of having state control, they went to federal control, and that pretty much worked, and that pretty well set the standard for the type of approach that would be used in other countries for polio eradication. But it was federal control, immunizing all the children in the country up to, at that time, it was 3 to 5 years. And it was twice, 2 times, 2 drops of polio vaccine, 2 months apart, and all in mass immunization. So that's how it sort of the way and the format for the program in the future.
And that happened after Cuba, correct?
About the same time. And so, I'm sorry, the first attempts in Brazil were actually mass immunizations, but they weren't done very well. And that was the same time as in Cuba. And of course, Cuba worked. But the reason why nobody picked up on the Cuban program is because they said, number one, Cuba was communist, and therefore they could make everybody do this. Cuba was an island, and therefore you didn't have importations and circulations like you did in other countries. So basically everybody dismissed Cuba because they said, you know, if it's just not a good model for the rest of the world. Well, it turned out it was more of a model than people thought it was, and it's getting around to that was what took a little time. But at the time we were talking about Sabin's involvement, this was in the 80s, and the pretty much, yeah, I'd say pretty much from 80, 85, 86 in that period of time.
Did you know Cerro de Quadros?
Oh yes, very, very much, and I think that when we go back to the beginnings of the program, the person that doesn't get a lot of credit, what I think deserves a huge amount of credit, was Dr. Risi, who is actually was Cerro de Quadros' boss back during the smallpox eradication days. All these people were in smallpox eradication. And that was, again, it's these people who had this eradication mindset in Brazil that made the whole thing happen.
Could you describe the eradication mindset?
The eradication?
Mindset?
Oh, the mindset. Oh, the eradication mindset. Oh, well, I mean, the eradication mindset is fairly straightforward. It's, hey, what's the ultimate goal of public health? Doing away with the disease, right? So that should be the goal of every public health program.
But not everybody answers that question in the same way. What is the goal of public health? Primary health care.
Oh, yeah, but I mean, we think of it from the standpoint of infectious diseases. Yeah, it's not, you don't want to waste your time sort of administering to the effects of the disease. You just want to get rid of it. I mean, you know, why have it around? And if you see that you can eliminate a disease within the countries, why can't you apply that widely? And, you know, I mean, why just keep spending money and without doing the job? And so
Risi was an eradicator.
Yeah, pretty much. Well, he was actually I think a superb organizer and good motivator, and he was head of the federal program at the time, and Sabin would you know, run hot and cold. You know, he would at times praise them and at times just create huge problems because he was so critical of the program. And what I will say that the other thing they introduced was a laboratory component to the program, because up until then it was mostly lameness surveys or mostly evidence of poliomyelitis, whereas and in fact the laboratory then was brought in to confirm that it was polio. But as time went on, the laboratory program, instead of being a hindsight or something that was used once again to confirm that it was polio, then the laboratory program really became the engine that moved the program, because not only could it confirm that it was a vaccine, confirm that it was polio, but also distinguish whether it was vaccine or wild virus. But also it got to the point where you could then determine by sequencing whether or not it was, how long it had been in circulation, where it came from. And I mean, it's just an incredible program, which is another. But back to Sabin and salk. Sabin, so that was the story on Sabin pretty much, but salk also was in influenza. And in fact, salk was working with influenza vaccines to improve them, to further purify them, make them so that they were less reactogenic, and increasing dosage and so on. It's probably some of the best work that salk ever did was prior to the polio work where he was working with influenza vaccines. And that's probably the reason why he was selected to work with polio vaccine, because they were both inactivated vaccines. So it means that the techniques were very similar. So what he really needed to do was his expertise in influenza vaccine was just apply that to polio vaccine. That was the concept of the time. And it pretty much worked that way, except by that time, it was really possible to use tissue culture to grow the virus in tissue culture. And so he introduced that as part of the polio, which was something new.
Did that enable the vaccine to be mass produced? Is that part of that story?
Yes, yes. It's the actual formulation of the media that would grow the tissue culture, the cell culture. It was called tissue culture there. It's called cell culture now. But yes, that allowed the whole thing to take, and concentrations, the ability to concentrate the viruses, all that came together about the same point. But this happened to be technology that was developing at the time. So then my memory of the two of them. Later, I also had much more to do with Salk on HIV vaccines, where he had decided he was going to get back into the vaccine business. Well, it didn't work. I mean, it was pretty dismal, but he was at the age, he didn't quite understand how dismal it was, but anyway, it didn't work. But I'll always remember that we were at this meeting with on influenza and the efficacy of the vaccine, and that Salk was sitting on one side of the table and Sabin was sitting on the other side of the table. And they were discussing a paper that I had written a few years before that. And so they both got into this discussion, and one or the other, I forget which, says, that isn't what he said. What he said was so-and-so. And so I'll always add, and so I was sitting there. And so I finally asked him, I said, can I say a word? I always remember that as probably the...
Do you remember what you said?
I said, you're both wrong, is what I started out saying. And I forget all the content, but that was some years ago. But that's a little incident I'll always remember.
That's great. I wanted to ask you too, if for your memories of first meeting each of them.
Well, I think like so many other way you meet these people who are at that time very famous and this type of thing is you see them at large conferences, or you get to the point that you see them but you don't really know them, but at least you know who they are, and you feel like that they're people that they're not entirely foreign to you. So it's not so much worshiping somebody from afar. You gradually see that they're human like other people. So then you may personally, as circumstances arise, you may get to know them actually personally, but you generally see them.
Do you remember the first time you spoke with Albert Sabin?
No, I don't know that I would identify. He was incredibly, I mean, he could be extremely cruel to people, or to put it another way, he didn't suffer fools gladly, and unfortunately many people he met were fools, and so having said that, then on the other side, that he could be extraordinarily gracious and very kind, and I always had a good relationship with Albert. And it wasn't always in agreement, but I never had a real problem.
I guess what I'm wondering, I'm wondering about the story of how that relationship kind of cemented itself. how it developed, like how did you get to a point in your relationship with Albert Sabin at which he would pick up the phone and say, Dr. Dowdle?
Oh, I'm sure it was totally initiated by him. But again, we'd met at meetings and smaller meetings, and in these smaller meetings. In fact, I spent let's say 1970, must have been 75. I spent a week with Sabin at a retreat in Switzerland. I mean, just to give you an idea, and that's where I also got to know his wife very well.
And what was the occasion for that? What was that retreat?
We did a retreat to try to make a decision on, okay, where do we go next on influenza vaccines? What road should we take? Because we weren't all that happy with the efficacy of the vaccine, and what might be next on the horizon. So there was this small meeting, primarily organized by the World Health Organization, with the two influenza centers that I referred to earlier, and then a number of other experts that were involved. It was in Rougemont, which is just north of Geneva. East of Geneva.
How about salk? Do you remember the first time you met and spoke with salk?
No, again, it's the large meetings, and then yeah. But he was not as much involved. But I think my better working relationship with Sabin actually occurred after our debate that fizzled out in New York, because we had a lot of time to actually work it all out. So it went quite well.
That's great. So yes. Okay. So you were working in flu. How did you come into polio?
Well, actually, being a virologist, I'd worked with polio in graduate school, along with other viruses. And so at the time, this was at the time before a live vaccine had been licensed when I was in graduate school. So we were still all caught up in the development of the live vaccine. And by that time, of course, the killed vaccine, salk vaccine, had already been introduced. But so, yeah, we worked with the polio strains, and, it was one of the things we were all sort of excited in. I mean, after all, that was a major accomplishment at the time. So polio was a big thing. So my interest in polio really came from then, at that time. And then when I came to Atlanta and was in the working with influenza and other respiratory diseases, the polio lab was right around the corner. And so we had a lot in common in terms of techniques used and so on and so forth. So it was sort of a natural flow. The interest was always there. And frequently we would get viruses that belonged over there and vice versa, and so we got to know each other quite well, and we worked very well together. So that was not a problem. But as we, I guess my real interest in polio, again, sort of started out from the possibility of polio, actually, the elimination of polio in different countries. This was before the eradication program actually was set up. But my actual real involvement in polio came from the time that I was appointed the director of the virology division. And
1973? I'm sorry to interrupt you.
The time?
Mm-hmm.
The time actually was in 72, the latter part of 72. But the case was the very famous case of rye versus Y vaccine. So what was happening is that there was a sabin vaccine vaccination day, and the young girl who had the vaccine came down with polio a few weeks later. The parents and the lawyers had blamed this on the vaccine. But in fact, we knew that polio was occurring in the location at the time. And secondly, we were able to show that epidemiologically it was most likely wild, and CDC provided that information. And third is that the strain, having been analyzed at the laboratory here in CDC, was most likely a live virus and not a vaccine virus. So there was no evidence that it was a vaccine virus that caused the paralytic result. But at the same time, there was no way you could say that it is absolutely sure that this was a vaccine, this was a live virus, wild virus versus a vaccine strain, because we had no techniques that would say that for sure beyond some biological variable characteristics. And so we couldn't say for certainty, although we could say 90% or 80%, or what have you. And so it became very clear that we had to have some other test, because it was extremely embarrassing that the jury just totally ignored everything that we presented because you couldn't prove it, with true physical proof. So at that time, I said, we can't continue like this. We've got to come up with some way to distinguish reliably between wild and vaccine strains. And so then that's where we started getting a molecular group in to start doing this. And so we've hired our first molecular virologist, and who in turn hired Olin Q to work specifically on polio viruses. And then Olin hired Mark Blanche a little later on, and the rest is history. But it's just incredible the difference the whole thing made. Just from once again, the laboratory that was hindsight, or to confirm something, versus the laboratory which was leading in terms of epidemiology, because of the way in which the vaccine became, the virus became characterized. So that was how my interest really.
The lab was really became key in surveillance. Would you say that it was key to surveillance from the beginning?
No, there was, in the beginning, there was some surveillance approaches used other than just lameness or paralytic disease itself. But it was very difficult, because it was often almost impossible to distinguish between live and between live vaccine strains and wild virus. Almost impossible, to the point that it just took too much time, and so you had to rely on other ways. But there was also surveillance which was done with looking at, say, subsamples of the population, and even environmental types of surveillance for the virus. But all these were sort of hindsights or special studies. They weren't a component at the time, or even in the definition of polio. And later it became that this was true. But so it's always had a role, but often because of the time it took, it was an after. The data came later, even though it was compiled and it was extremely important, but you had to do something faster than that.
For the record, could you explain what happened when a case of acute flaccid paralysis was identified in the field in the early days? What happened?
Well, I think Oleg could probably, fill you in on this, and so I won't say much about this. But basically, it was the clinical definition which sort of held sway. But it became clear, the reason why the lab follow-up became important is because it became clear in the early programs in Brazil that often you would come across a paralysis that was not polio. And clinically, it most of them were pretty evident it wasn't polio, but not always. And so therefore, if you could isolate a virus in the laboratory at the same time you saw the patient, then you were certain that that was a polio or cause or associated paralysis. And so it was paralytic poliomyelitis, which you could now say that's for sure because we got both the virus and the clinical definition. So as a follow-up, that was always important, but that follow-up often took a little time because you had to grow the virus, you had to, so, and then there's always a 60-day follow-up whether or not the child was still paralyzed.
Before Q came in 1979, could you describe the technique used to determine that 90% likelihood that X virus came from, to trace the virus?
Oh, you mean whether it was wild or vaccine associated? Yeah. Largely, it had to do with temperature, the growth at which the virus would replicate, and one thing, and the other thing was the appearance of the strain, the plaque size, and so on at these different temperatures. And so there were a number of these biological phenomena that you would look at. And of these, then temperature was probably the most important, and plaque size at temperature. But all these were variables. All these would change because they would change. In other words, the longer the virus circulated, then it would become more wild-like if it was successful in its transmission. So you couldn't say for certain because it was always, a sort of a continuum. There was a line there that sort of separated the attenuated strains from the fully virulent strains, and it wasn't straight. I mean, it was always a continuum. The line was because it was biological. Whereas if you looked at the nucleic acid, looked at the genetic material, then you could see exactly what changes were being made and what the origin of the virus was.
Which was what Olin Q brought to
exactly
lab.
Yeah. And perfected it as time went on. Yeah.
Could you talk about where you were in your career at this time? So you were 1973 director of the virology division. But then 1979, you moved into a different role. So I'm wondering about the timing of when you recruited Q and how that happened.
Well, this was the assistant director for science, I believe, at the time. There was almost an internal move within CDC into reorganize, getting organized for a different organization. Quite frankly, there was a.
What do you mean by that?
No, what I mean by that is that they really were thinking in terms of combining the laboratory branch and the epidemiology branch into a new center. And that took about 2 years in the making. And all of this happened to occur about the time of the incoming, I think it was the Reagan administration. I think this was, and there were serious at that time, proposals of cutting CDC by 25% and reducing staff. We actually had lists drawn up of who would get cut, reduction in force, and all this sort of thing. It was really quite scary. So all this sort of the reorganization got caught up. And so they were able to move at least on a few things. And one of the things was just to have an assistant director for science. And that's sort of how that happened. But the rest of the reorganization got caught up. And all that occurred a few years later. I'm not exactly. It's when I was appointed the director of Center for Infectious Diseases.
Mm-hmm.
That was the result of the reorganization that affected us directly.
And that would have been James Mason. He had arrived at CDC by that point?
Not yet. It was still
Fege.
Bill Fege. And so it's that time under Bill Fege's direction that we established the different centers. And Center for Infectious Diseases combined Bureau of Laboratories and the Bureau of Epidemiology.
And that was in response to this.
And lived happily ever after. It really was. I mean, it was a fun time, and just not on the political side, but I mean at least from the organization side. But as I point out, by being a part of the virology division early on, and we had, from the beginning, we've had very close working relationships with the epidemiologist, and I mean, and really, it didn't so much matter. The organization lines weren't that important. They really weren't. If you needed to work on a particular outbreak or particular disease, hey, it just sort of flowed naturally that you would work together. So it really worked out quite well.
So after the reorganization, you were the director for the Center for Infectious Disease, and that was 1980 to 1986, right?
Yeah.
So that, what were you hearing about polio at CDC and more broadly than that at that point in time?
Well, being in the Center for Infectious Diseases, of course, polio was still very much a part of that and the interest. And so yeah, I was aware, and and getting reports from the different staff members on this, and so I was fully aware of what was going on, and I wouldn't say inserted myself, but at least I tried to keep up with what was going on. But it's mostly what was occurring within the organization. I mean, I wasn't personally directing this.
Sure. I wondered if you heard responses. There was a meeting in Talois, France in 1983, I believe. NIH Fogarty Center sponsored a symposium at PAHO. And I was wondering if you heard reactions of your colleagues to that meeting.
Oh yeah, that was well. Most of the reaction to that meeting was total disbelief after it happened. And here again, this was a meeting which was sponsored by the Task Force for Global Health, and Bill Fege essentially was chairing it, headed it. I'm not sure he was chair of that meeting, but basically with previous meetings he was. And this involved WHO, director of WHO, director of UNICEF and Rockefeller Foundation, World Bank, and the usual group that formed the task force at that time. And so they were charting where to go next and how to improve immunization by continuing to work together, which was the whole concept of the task force, and to try to get above the the sort of institutional lines and to try to put your forces together to really do some good instead of worrying about turf, And so, and it just sort of a natural outcome of that meeting then, and I say natural outcome, the Cerro de Cuadros pushed very hard, and Mercedes from Pajo also was very strong on polio eradication because they'd done very well in Latin America by that time. And so the big the major outcome of that meeting was the fact that they had convinced Bala, who was the WHO director at the time, that this would be another what was referred to as a vertical program, and where WHO had just, about 3 years earlier in the Almaty conference, had made the decision to never have another vertical program, that all these programs would be integrated into a single control, or what was called a horizontal program, where you put everything together. And so Bala then went back in about 3 months, went back to WHO and talked the World Health Assembly into having a polio eradication program. It was an extraordinary outcome, which flip-flopped. I mean, he was totally against it because they said that when smallpox finished in 1980, when it was declared eradicated in 1980, that they said there'd never be another vertical program. And so all this was just at that time, from that conference, was just turned around.
Did you hear any mention of incoming Director General Nakajima?
Well, I think we have to say that the staff at WHO had bought into the horizontal program, no more vertical programs. And pretty much that was the mantra within the organization. And so when this decision was made to go on a eradication program for polio, the thought was among the staff that, hey, we've got no resources, we've got, how are we supposed to do this? Is this just one more thing that's, going to be a pie in the sky type of goal, and it'll eventually go away, or how many years we've got, and so on and so forth. And so they were very reluctant to move forward. And I will say, Rafe Henderson was one of the proponents of polio eradication, who was also at the conference. And Rafe Henderson, of course, was a CDC person assigned to WHO at the time. He was in favor, but not in favor of going right now, but a little bit later. and it took a lot to get it started. It took a lot. It was very slow getting things going and getting people to think about it in different ways, because it was huge. I mean, just think of what few resources are available to WHO, and the staff members, the staff is so small. So how do you do it? And so that's when CDC, and I give a lot of credit to Bob Keegan and Steve Kachi and others who said, now we're getting into the 90s, though, and then they were saying, okay, why don't we hold these meetings, trying to get all the groups together and trying to move forward. And
before we go there, could you talk about where you were in your career in, I guess, mid to late 80s? Something like that, around the time the WHA, so around 1988.
Right, 1988?
Mm-hmm.
I was at the task force, no, I'm sorry, I was not at the task force. Where was I? I was...
Were you working on AIDS?
No, I was working on AIDS. That's what, okay. Yeah, sorry.
No, that's okay. I'm interested in the story of your mentorship for Steve Kochi, Bob Keegan, Olin Q. Actually, maybe that's a good entry point. Could you tell the story of recruiting Olin Q to CDC in 1979 from University of
Well, the
Wisconsin?
actual recruitment was done by Jack Obajeski, who was the person who was actually the first molecular virologist that we had on the staff. He was the first one, but as you can imagine, he was overwhelmed. And so what we needed was a person assigned just to do polio, to work on polio. And so Jack was the one who actually hired me. I interviewed Olin, but Jack was the person who actually hired Olin because he was familiar with the molecular virology field. So that's and at that time I was director of the virology division.
And did you give Jack the okay to hire this new person?
Yeah.
Bob Keegan wrote a paper. It's a history of CDC's role in polio,
Right.
mainly from his tenure, and before that too. He really
Right.
did a wonderful job, and I'm so grateful to have been able to read it and work with that. It's laid a foundation for me in what I'm doing now.
But I once again though, let me pick up on what I was saying about we weren't moving forward that much with WHO, and we'd assign people over to WHO, and not much was happening, and it was just hard to push because the Nakajima at that time wasn't that supportive and so on. So that's when Bob and Steve and also Patriarcha.
Peter
Patriarcha was involved as well. He was very much a supporter. And they started having meetings here at CDC, getting WHO people to come over here. And so I don't know how many meetings there were, but it must have been 3 or 4 meetings over here at least. It got to the point it kept growing and growing, and more excitement and interest and support was developing here. And WHO decided, hey, we got to bring this back. So they brought the whole program back, and then from then on it went fine. I mean, it's fine as you can imagine here, but at least that really is what I thought made the program go forward. Now, Steve may not tell you that, but that's what I thought was the big push to get the program part, and that was sending WHO the message, okay, if you're not going to do it, we will do it. And
when did those meetings begin? When did they start hosting WHO staff here?
Right around 90. It must have been probably 92 or something like that, 91 or 92, something about that.
Was that before or after the funding request?
That was before.
Before,
actually.
okay.
Yeah, that was before.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I want to go ahead and think about 1989, April 1989.
Yeah.
If my dates are correct. You received a proposal, I believe, that you later passed on to James Mason, director of CDC.
Yeah.
And eventually I believe that resulted in the $3.1 million
Right.
allocation that continued to allow the polio program at CDC to expand.
Right.
Could you tell the story of the development of that proposal, whether or not you were involved, at what point you became involved in it?
Yeah. Well, let me back up a little bit. That CDC was from its beginning, has always been seen as a domestic organization, that its mission was domestic for disease control here. And then there was thought that all of the international work that was done in medicine or in health, public health, was to be done by the Agency for International Development, AID, which was out of the State Department. And so there was, for a long time, there was this very, very strict line between no authorization for CDC to do any global work, but all of the authorization would go through Agency for International Development, who would in turn, quote unquote, hire CDC to do this work. Now, they did a lot of work in overseas. But even the smallpox eradication work, what CDC did was primarily provide technical assistance and people in the field and this type of thing, whereas the money is for anything else, which was very, very little, but would come out of AID. And so it was about this time that in the early 90s that there was a lot of, I think, more and more support that CDC is being shackled, with this arrangement, and that there should be direct funding for any of the particularly health programs. I mean, later with Ebola, for example, everybody understands that it's something that CDC needs to get involved in. And so that was pretty much a breakthrough. That there may have been other sort of direct fundings to CDC, but not many. This sort of broke the sort of the tradition, if you will, and so it was a big thing. And then in order to get more funding, of course, then this relationship was set up with the task force and Rotary for fundraising, lobbying, if you will. but then that got to be a problem. It got worked out pretty quickly, and I don't want to go into this, but the way it was worked out is that Rotary then accepted the responsibility for lobbying for CDC.
That's actually a really important story, and I know
Yeah.
you said that maybe you would not necessarily want to talk about it just now, but would you tell the story of how all of that worked out, how Rotary came to lobby? Because there is a bit of history of Rotary International feeling undercredited by CDC.
Right.
And I was wondering if you could talk about it a little bit and how it was resolved and how the two have worked together.
Yeah. In regard to, well, Rotary, of course, was involved very early in polio elimination in the Americas, and that was through Pan American Health Organization, through PAHO. And so it was intended to be a very limited program and targeted only to Latin America, at the Americas at the time. And the assumption was that this would be for a short period of time and they would move on and do other things. And the involvement of Rotary with the program, again, goes back to Albert Sabin. And Albert Sabin was the one who talked them into doing this, helping out Brazil. That's how it all got started. So this was a departure for them, because usually their own short-term programs and this type of thing, they'd never taken on anything like this. They didn't know how big it was going to get at the time. It really got big. So it was a growing, it was a learning process for them. It was a learning process for everybody. So when it came to getting funding for themselves, of course, they depended entirely on the membership. But then it also became clear that they could play an enormous role with their good relationship with Congress to lobby for polio eradication, for getting funds for CDC. And but that didn't immediately become clear to them. It became clear to them when the the Task Force for Global Health actually hired somebody to start doing lobbying for polio. But when Rotary got wind of it, then, well, I mean, they were informed, but when they got wind of it, they decided that wasn't a good idea because they thought it would work better under them.
Because of their ability to advocate and influence?
Well, they were planning on doing something similar. But, you know, I mean, hey, Rotary doesn't actually have to introduce themselves in, you know, various places. Many members of Congress are Rotarians, and so it's a very easy thing to do to get this type of support, and you know, it's humanitarian. It's the thing that the Rotary organization does, and so it was a natural fit. And I think that the task force made a nice, you know, gesture, but it was the right thing to do, to go with. And then actually Rotary didn't have anybody in mind, but had John Seaver was and John Seaver was a virologist, someone known for many, many years. And at the time, John had, through his hospital, had various people who were lobbying, and one was this newly formed Capital Associates, and that's how that came about. John was a member and still is advisory.
We actually spoke. I interviewed him.
Oh, did you?
Yes,
oh, okay.
yes. In Evanston, Illinois. He's wonderful, and he actually lives in Potomac, Maryland, which is the county I went to high school in.
There was a lot of movement then that that Bob Keegan was involved in. Bob worked very closely with Rotary, but he also did a lot of work in the legislative area as well. And primarily through the Bumpers, Senator Bumper and his wife, these people were prime movers on immunization. It's that connection that.
I was hoping, could we back up a little bit? Because I did want to bring in this bit of information. Rotary withdrew, if I understand it correctly, did they withhold funding or decide at one point that relationships were not great, they were going to withdraw or decrease the amount of funding that they were giving to CDC? And then later that changed and the partnership continued, but wonder if you could talk about that.
I've often thought about that, but I'm not certain that this was a Rotary concern so much as it was an internal organization issue, which they abandoned. And that's what made the relationship work once they sort of abandoned their internal organization that had to do with polio, because they had experts in polio who were actually on the staff.
Dr. Sever? Or he was not staff?
No, he was never. He was always an advisor at the higher level, and he was never a technical advisor. I mean, sure he was, but I mean he was at the governing, on the governing body, and so when they actually decided themselves that they would continue to be fundraising and to continue to do lobbying and this type of thing, and let WHO and CDC and UNICEF do the technical stuff, then everything worked fine. And we didn't hear any more about lack of identification or lack of credit and this type of thing. I will say in their defense that they probably were not getting credit as much as they should have, but it was not a conscious thing. It was just something that somebody had to be aware of, and it was. And I always felt that the withholding of money is trying to decide what they're going to do, rather than any problem related to that. I always thought that was a little thing, that thought it got built up beyond what it really was.
Because I think Rotary at that time experienced a shift in their leadership also.
Yes, of course. Yeah, it was all at the same time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, that's what my point was. That it's the internal organization that they had to decide on, and they made the right decision. And that's where Bill Sargent came in.
Could you talk about Bill Sargent?
Well, just a remarkable guy. I mean, gruff, very gruff. It's amazing how gruff he could be and how critical he could be. Yet he was one of the most sensitive, people I think I've ever known. I mean, he really sincerely believed in this program and believed what Rotary was doing, and he was quite a guy. And we've run across quite a few of these quite guys, women and as well, I can assure you. Which is, I don't know how much time we're going yet to have, but this is a point I'd like to make. We're maybe getting away for a little bit from the subject, but the people who've worked on this program, and in many of the health programs, particularly international health programs, are just extraordinary people, and they all are. And in the polio program, there's been many situations where security problems, there's internal strife, there's all sorts of opportunities to be threatened in the process. And as we know, there have been a number of people who were polio vaccinators who've been killed, particularly in the Middle East, and we've had people here. To me, some of the most dangerous positions have been filled by women, CDC women, and I'm always just amazed at what they've done and the extraordinary work that they've done under extremely difficult and threatening conditions.
Could you tell some stories about them? Who were these people that you're thinking of?
Well, one person comes to mind and there are many others. One person comes to mind is Anne Renee Hindenburg. I don't know whether you've run across her.
I have not met her in person yet, but I am looking forward to it.
Yeah. Well, Anne Renee has been involved in some of the most difficult parts of the program, I can imagine. Somalia, Sudan, almost all in the Civil War times, all these issues. And almost every time there was a big problem, Anne Renee got sent to the... and Anne Renee, just to give you, and there are other examples, but I can just say something about her, and that gives you an idea of what others have done. She was in the, I think it was in Somalia and Mogadishu, running back and forth and trying to get refugees immunized and working within the country and this type of thing. She was stationed in Nairobi at the time, but that was her base of operations. And she was not at Nairobi at the time, but still the base of operations. She was there when Louise Martin was killed in the embassy bombing, and Louise Martin was there as previous CDC employee, but her husband, Doug Klauke, was there on the polio program. And
were there 3 children there too?
Yeah, there were 3 children. And so in addition to all of her other problems, Anne Renee also did her best to work to try to hold the family together, and so it was really quite a tragedy. And that was another thing in which she said done a remarkable job. And to put in a plug here,
Go ahead. Yeah.
we started the task force, and CDC colleagues and friends of Louise took up collection to form a memorial to her. And this memorial was an endowment fund for scholarships for girls' education in Kenya. And that has continued to grow. And the program now supports the endowment fund, which is operated out of CDC Foundation. And Anne Renee and myself continue to work on this program. And we now support, the endowment now supports 6 girls a year. We hopefully get more than that, but through secondary school in this very successful girls center and school in Nairobi. So it just keeps going on.
I think
and
it's really
contributions will be accepted.
Thank you, Dr. Dowdle.
but it's something that CDC employees should recognize that you've got all these things. Then you've got Bob Keegan's program that he started, his endowment program for people who were injured or for the families who were killed working on polio eradication. And these wonderful programs.
Could you talk about Bob Keegan? And maybe we can keep going with talking about individual people. Like, I would love to hear more about some of the women that you were referring to before, but Bob Keegan, and then the group of people that you mentored closely as well. So
yeah, well, I mentioned Anne Renee because I know more of what she did, but there are really literally that many of the other women who've done a tremendous job, and I'd hate to go much further than that because I'd be leaving out somebody, and they'd all recognize that it's okay to mention Anne Renee, but I don't know. Many of these are supporting roles. There are also women who were involved in the big strategies, the programs, and that type of thing. But they weren't all in the trenches like they were. But also, men too that have had and still do have some very challenging jobs.
there are many. Yes, I did a pre-interview yesterday with Dr. Dury.
I mean, he's another one of these people that, if you have something that's an impossible situation, you send him there.
Sounds like it. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So in the early 90s, I was hoping to talk with you about navigating bureaucracy in the early 90s. And this team, Bob Keegan, Steve Kochi, Olin Q, Mark Palanche,
right.
Peter Patriarca.
Yeah. Well,
also?
Peter Patriarca left in the early 90s. I mean, when was this? Yeah, it must have been, early, mid-90s, yeah.
Okay. I wanted to ask you about them on an individual level, and then also ask you, ask you about your role as a mentor. Several of these folks have described you as the godfather of polio eradication, the polio eradication activity, and just as a very influential person to them in learning to make things happen. So I was hoping you could speak about them and speak to working with them.
Right. Yeah. Well, first, during this time, I was acting. I mean, I was deputy director. During that time, I was also acting director of CDC on 2 occasions, and one was for a year or more. So that's where, there was a lot more interactions with the program and support of the program. And the support was more obvious, I guess, during that time. But as far as mentoring, I would have to say I was mentored by them, the other way around. Is that they had these extraordinary ideas. They had this commitment and just very dedicated to the whole concept and getting the job done. I mean, how can you not get excited and enthused over the program? So you might say, I did what I could to try to help things along, this type of thing, but they're my heroes. It's not the other way around. I mean, these guys just did extraordinary work.
What were some of the first things that happened to get things moving?
Well, what happened to get things moving really was the meetings over here at CDC back in the early 90s instead of WHO, is that CDC took the initiative and said, okay, we're going to get the job done.
Who was it?
Well, who actually started? My memory of it was with Bob and Steve, but Peter may have been involved in the first one. That's what I can't be sure of. But that's my memory of those meetings with Bob and Steve.
Do you remember when you first heard about the idea of these meetings? Did they come to your office and say?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, definitely. We talked about having them here, which I thought was a great idea.
But they approached you. When would you see them on a day-to-day? What were your interactions with Steve Kochi and Bob Keegan like? Would you see them in meetings? Where would you see them?
We had frequent meetings and generally in the office, and I would attend what meetings I could with them, but I had many other things I had to deal with as well, other programs that were going on. But again, I would downplay my job my role as a mentor. I still think they're the ones that were stimulating me instead of the other way around. But I'm glad they think that way. But
I've heard the comment that you really encouraged them to kind of expand their vision.
Yeah,
and dream really big.
Yeah. But that's easy to do, right? And it's the people who are down at the bottom that are thinking of all of the barriers and all of the needs and the money and this type of thing who tend to think a little smaller. And so when you're up 30,000 feet, it's easy to think about expanding it and keeping it moving.
So how did you kind of guide that shift?
Oh, well, I can give you one example here that Bob Keegan used to always say that one reason why the polio program took off is because the formation of the national immunization program. And
Clinton?
Sorry?
Clinton? Was that under Clinton?
Yes, it was. But anyway, the National Immunization Program, which is the CDC program, that was actually under the Bureau of State Services. And the Bureau of State Services is what it is. It handled block grants. It handles, at that time, all immunization had to do with states. So it was working with states to get their immunization programs up to par and all this sort of thing. So in many ways, it was a natural fit in the Bureau of State Services. But it was pretty much down the organizational line, so to speak. So by pulling the national immunization, creating the national immunization program and bringing it up to director level so that it reported directly to the director, well, then this changed the whole sort of environment of and also the image, the way in which the program was viewed. But it didn't happen exactly the way they thought it did. And the way it happened is that at the time that I'm just trying to think exactly when it was Clinton, I guess, when they actually, the new administration came in, D.A. Henderson was brought in at the assistant secretary level at the HHS, Health and Human Services. And D.A. Henderson felt like that the immunization program was very bad. He was extremely critical. And so he said that he felt like that the program should be brought up to his office in the Assistant Secretary for Health. And so at that time, I was acting director here at CDC. So we said, this can't happen. We can't do that. So anyway, went through a whole series of things. This went on for weeks. And so finally, I proposed to him as, okay, if we pull the program out of Bureau of State Services and bring it up to the director level, that's the most we can do. We cannot agree for this program to go up to your office. No way. Anyway, he accepted the compromise because then he thought he had a way to get to it this way. And so that's how it happened. It wasn't, consciously done in the sense that there wasn't a real, motive to do so. It was, but that's the way things often got done. And unfortunately, a DA was a real critic of the polio program. But
could you talk about that?
Well, DA headed up the smallpox eradication program in WHO, and before that, I'd worked with DA fairly closely. I'd known DA since, I guess he arrived. Well, he arrived about the same time I did here at CDC, but in a different position. He did a good job in smallpox. Smallpox was primarily the U.S. and Russia who actually supported the program and got it done. And DA headed up what small monies they were compared to polio eradication, and did that type of work at WHO. So he had done a good job. But he also felt like he had other, he could advise other programs as well as including the polio eradication program, and they never quite suited him. He never thought it was going to work, and he was just constantly critical to the point that it just wasn't helpful. It's one thing to be critical and be helpful, and this was part of that time where he was just extremely critical of the whole program, and which is too bad. I mean, I personally had good relations with DA, but it didn't extend all the way to the working relationships. But he he had a lot of credit, and he deserved that credit.
So when Clinton came into office, that provided an opportunity, I think, for the bumpers to become more involved in expanding immunization. Could you talk about their role?
Well, this is where Steve comes in. Yeah, can give you a real good breakdown. He and Bob were very much involved, and Bob really more so. Yeah.
I'm very disappointed that I will not have the chance to meet Bob Keegan.
Well, aren't we all? Yeah. Yeah.
I am truly. Could you talk about him a bit in terms of personality and work style? Seems like he had a very strong value for collaboration. But yeah, I see that play out in the writing that I've seen of his, and just the things that I hear other people say about him.
I would put this just a little differently.
Okay.
And in that I think that Bob had this very deep commitment to accomplish something in this world. Not himself, but to change. To get things like eradicate polio, or things that were big and things that could be accomplished. It's not, and then in that desire or in that commitment, he recognized that the only way you do that is through collaboration. So
it was a strategy.
Yeah, that was the strategy, and so he recognized that you just had to make collaboration work, because if you didn't, you're not going to accomplish the goal and the mission. So in that respect, he was very, very I think influential and helpful in almost anything that was done. But Bob was the type of person, for example, that if you could have a meeting for 30 minutes or an hour to actually come to some agreement on some particular course of action to take, Bob would sit there. Often he would, if he wasn't chairing the meeting, he still had the same role. But anyway, he would say at the end, he says, "Okay, what's the action here? All right, who's going to do it?" And we never left a meeting there by leaving it open. It never happened. Bob just moved everything along. Okay, what's going to be accomplished? Who's going to do it? When are you going to do it? How are you going to pay for it? All that sort of thing had to be. He really committed, and nothing was left open. It was always decision had to be made. But he had many. I used to always say that when you're meeting with Bob, you've always had to hold on to your wallet, because he was determined. I used to accuse him of of dueling with windmills, because he just had so many different things he wanted to do. He wanted to get involved with form a gun control group here in Atlanta. Well, that never got off the ground, despite all the ways of trying. He was really quite a motivator. Really quite a motivator.
Let me do a time check. We are at about an hour and a half at this point, so we can start the winding down process.
Okay.
I wanted to ask you about the task force and your work there. So you retired from CDC in 1994. Did you move over to the task force for global health immediately?
When I retired, because of my WHO network lab development for influenza, I really enjoyed that area. The thing that I found most stimulating is building these laboratories in developing countries, because they were absolutely abysmal. They were just not only for the laboratories, but competence and so on and so forth, really were. And the general feeling was you can't, build functional, really high quality laboratories in these areas. They don't have the equipment, they don't have the money, they don't have personnel and so on and so forth. And but yet in flu it worked pretty well, but it was not the same level that was needed for polio. So that was a real interest of mine. So when I retired with that interest, I went then to Mark and Olin and said, hey, here's your new volunteer hand. And so I went back to the lab. And so then I gradually sort of got involved into the program, but the lab base working out of their lab. So going back to the labs, I went back, did all the procedures that I hadn't done in my earlier lab days. And so,
what were some of those?
well, I mean, like the neuromolecular virology, was sequencing and all of these, nucleic acid isolation and all that sort of stuff. It wasn't even invented, at the time. And so I went back and did a lot of that, and never became as proficient as they were, obviously, but that was enough then. So I felt confident to go back and start helping develop the network. And I will say that we all were a little reluctant to give too much responsibility to these labs because of what they could really accomplish. But in the end, they were really very good.
What were some of your concerns, the specific concerns about giving too much control over to the labs?
Well, the main thing we had to be concerned about is quality control, and the whole concept of quality control, and how do you do this? And so that's what we set about doing first, is getting these labs, starting off with the most basic things, and then that is just isolating the virus and being able to identify the virus. Then you send it to a next level laboratory of more capabilities, larger facilities, and this type of thing would actually distinguish whether it was wild or vaccine type. And then as time went on, then you went to the even larger laboratories, which is like CDC, and to do the sequencing, genetic work at this time. But then as time went on, you started bringing these things down to the developing laboratory level, so that you started then letting them doing the separation of wild and vaccine type strains, and then you can see how this, and then some genetic work which would allow them to start doing some of the sequencing and so on and so forth, and then that kept going further and further down. And so I mean the labs by and large, with I would say a very few exceptions, but there were a few exceptions, but the rest of the lab, I mean, they all did a superb job and still do.
Within your own story, when did you go back into working with lab?
When did
you return to lab work?
Oh, immediately. We took 2 weeks off, I think, and went back.
In 1994?
1994.
Incredible. And so you were working on a programmatic level?
Yeah, I was in the lab working on, some of the polio research issues.
Mm-hmm. What kinds of meetings were you a part of?
Oh, at that time, all of them. I mean, anything that involved the lab here at CDC, I was involved in. But then I started gradually involving myself with the WHO at the Geneva level.
Okay. Could you talk about that experience?
Well, again, by my first involvement with WHO in Geneva at that level and the regional level was back to influenza, because that's I operated a similar type program for influenza, and that goes back to 64, 65, something like that. So it's quite a while ago, and I think at my time, at that time, I recognized what WHO's strengths were and what their weaknesses were. And at the same time, I also gained enormous admiration for the people who worked at WHO at the technical level, who weren't concerned with the bureaucracy so much, but rather at the technical level. And all through, from the 60s on, it's been my experience that the people that you've worked with on these specific programs are just, they're also extraordinary, very dedicated people. And it's always been a very pleasant experience. Again, differences of opinion, this type of thing, but everybody's working for the same goal. And so there are certainly bureaucratic problems, but your role is to try to work around them. I mean, that's and Bob understood that very well.
Can you give a few examples of when you have been involved in working around bureaucratic problems?
I didn't. Most of the bureaucratic problems related to money and money issues, and so I didn't get that much involved in that. I mean, but the people who did were Bob, and the other person who was expert at taking shortcuts was Anne Renee, and working around it. Now, actually, on the smallpox eradication program, they actually handed out cash to people to get around and so but there are ways of doing it, and you can get around it, and it's not that it's so much that the hierarchy is trying to enforce the bureaucracy, but you also got to think in an international organization, you can't have the organization have the face that everybody looks alike. I mean, you've got to have different countries represented. You can't have too many from one country. I mean, for example, if you want a good technical operation, then at WHO, then you want to get the best technical people you could get. Well, in the early days, they all came from where? They either came from the U.S. or they came from Britain, some from Germany. But so it was almost a U.S.-British type of operation, and that has changed a lot. So that now they have to have quotas, which is bureaucratic. Now, even then, they had these types of problems, but they in some ways ignored them. But they've had to enforce them as time has gone on. And so you have people who are not so competent, who haven't had the experience, and then people who do. But you try to get at least the head of the program, somebody who's very competent, and usually that person would be from the U.S. or the U.K. I mean, that's the way it was, but not anymore. But that was part of the bureaucratic problems that we had. Once again, to see what's changed, but in a very limited time. But some of these developing countries, have very strong technical people now, almost any aspect.
Who would you name among countries with strong technical programs?
Well, for example, when we first started out with China, the polio program, China had nobody. I mean, virtually nobody, and then we trained a person over here who headed up the program, and then we also here at CDC trained other people from the China program, but virtually nobody. And
what was the name of the person who headed the program in China here? The CDC or?
Oh, who had the,
Mm-hmm.
you mean who was here?
Mm-hmm. Who was working at CDC on China? Who was the head of the program?
I'm trying to think of at the lab level, there was,
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
Yeah, the lab person who would
lab.
share the information with China.
Oh, oh, yeah. Now I know who you're talking about. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
It's,
I could, yeah.
yeah, yeah. There were two people from Taiwan. Yeah, yeah, and they're no longer here. You're right. Yeah,
Okay.
both have retired now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, I was trying to think who was it that was trained here, and
Oh, no.
no. You're right. Yeah,
Yeah. Still learning.
yeah.
Still learning. Wonder if it makes sense to continue. Could you talk about lab? Did you ever go out on lab visits? Did you visit?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Well,
Could
that
you
was
talk
all
about,
part of the yeah.
yeah, could you talk about some of your experiences, memorable visits?
Well, in the early days, would go to these different labs and and trying to focus on the labs that needed the most help at the time, and primarily setting up the quality control programs and making sure they understood what they were, how to, the techniques involved, and so on and so forth. I went through all that with them, and so I used to say that it was that the most frequent phrase I ever used is that you're doing what? And that used to be what I would get every time I'd go there. You're doing what? And so then you would correct that.
Which labs in your memory needed some more support than others? Where did you spend the most time? Where did you need to spend the most time?
Well, as we got, so we had a different tiers. We had, as I mentioned earlier, you had the labs that did the work in the countries, and then you had lab at the regional level, which actually then it was a bigger institution, better trained personnel, and in fact, often career personnel in the job, and so on and so forth. They took a lot of the responsibility at the regional level for going out as they became stronger, and to going out and making sure that the labs were all helping them to get up to speed, and so on and so forth. I guess some of the biggest problems earlier on had to do with the regional labs in China, because they were all so far behind everywhere. And so going out to all the provincial labs in China, and also working with the Chinese lab that was responsible for all these, and that was probably a challenge. But again, they ended up doing quite well.
Dr. Palanche mentioned in his pre-interview observing very, very high rates of unexplained wastage in China. Were you aware of that?
High wastage of
vaccine.
Oh, vaccine, yeah.
And he attributed that to the one-child policy.
Yeah, that's right.
And people having more than one
Sure.
child.
Yes, that's correct.
So I was wondering if you had heard about that.
Yes, yeah.
In your work.
Yeah, no, that's a problem with the program. All the hidden children who are not registered, at all. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah. No, I mean, it really makes you realize that when you give people opportunities and give them the ability to work with something and give them the tools to do something, that almost anywhere in the world you can get these, you can bring people up to standards. And, we don't have a monopoly. And fortunately, less and less, there's nothing about the UK and US is so bright that the others can't do it. It all has to do with opportunity. And And that's what sort of building the lab work will always just prove to me all the time. It's just amazing what people can do if you give them the right training, right opportunities, and right equipment to do it.
Did you ever advocate on a policy level for the lab network?
Oh yeah, yes, of course. But I mean, at the level I worked at WHO, in Geneva, that was
What you
that
did.
was the responsibility. Yeah.
Could you share some of your thought processes or strategies that you remember from that time in learning to communicate that message? That given the tools and the opportunity, people can be competent and
Yeah. Well, it was just a developmental process. In other words, a lot of this was actually consciously done by the laboratory network with Olin and Mark, actually, because they visited a lot of labs as well, but giving their sense of readiness, or we think this lab now is ready to actually start doing sequencing, for example. And if so, how do we get the equipment to do it? And the other labs, for example, the Indian labs just did a fantastic job. But it was, largely funds that were provided by WHO through Rotary or through our funding, whatever.
what were some of the indicators of readiness when you would look at a lab?
Well, I guess a lot was subjective in some ways, but at the same time, you could see how these labs would perform in the more, the basic test, and as the more difficult test as you went up, and I mean, it's pretty obvious who.
In terms of skill, you
Yeah,
mean?
in terms of skills, it was pretty obvious. But it was more than the skills. It was also reporting. I would say not just accuracy, but also timeliness was important, and the ability to get things out fast, and the dedication to move things along, and that was also part of the evaluation.
Anything else you'd like to say about the lab network?
No, I mean, just to say that I guess my career has been more learning than anything else, and one thing I think I've learned is from the very beginning. I just keep getting it reinforced and reinforced. Is again the concept of what people can do if given the right opportunity, all over the world, and that's of course one thing we feel so strongly about the girls' school we're promoting is that to give girls the chance to get ahead in life and to realize their potential, and that's something that can be repeated, all over the world. There's no exception. I remember in the HIV program that we were in Kinshasa. We were in Kinshasa and actually were meeting with this guy who was I refer to as a bush doctor. I mean, it had no equipment. He was a doctor out in the bush, no equipment, nothing but his knowledge and his hands. And so we were trying to really get a fix on, was there HIV occurring in Africa, as some had reported. Well, it was showing up in the hospital in Kinshasa. And this guy, in very broken English, I mean, he just, on his own observations, he'd had HIV down to a T. I mean, he was it's just incredible how he could actually identify the cases, how he could describe the cases, and had kept up with this as his own little surveillance, if you will, and just if you ever saw a person, I mean, dressed very poorly, but if you ever saw a person that you would expect to do a job like that, it wouldn't have been him. I mean,
What did he look like?
little small guy, very, very not well dressed. I mean, clearly about on the level of poverty of many others, but he was serving out in the villages and doing the best job he could. And but he understood, recognized HIV well before it had been recognized globally.
It's wild.
Yeah.
I feel like I've heard similar stories of country doctors.
Yeah.
You know,
Which is what
he was.
What he was.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just a lot of bright people out there.
Tons. Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of bright people.
Absolutely. There's a really great Goulding quote that I tend to mess up a lot, but it's the gist of it is he says that he mourns for all of the people who could have been great scientists or whatever, but labored away in fields and expired in exploitation, which is interesting and kind of a loaded idea to leave this interview on. So I'm sorry to do that. Didn't mean to do that. But yeah, somehow that seems relevant. Yeah. Do you have any, so you said earlier that you would be open to a second interview?
I don't know what else there is to say.
Okay. Well, that's a great indicator. Maybe we got most of it.
Yeah.
Do you have any other kinds of closing thoughts? Anything that's hanging on? Did we miss anything?
No, but I think, I mean, when you think back to what my career was, I was involved in so many other things at the same time. For example, at the time of Louise Martin's death at the embassy, I was actually heading up a malaria program. So she was working for me on the malaria program. She'd never actually been worked at the task force, but because we were working out of Nairobi and, Kenya and Uganda, and she was there with all these talents, we just, hired her for the program. So she was never actually at the task force, but she was a task force employee there in Kenya. So I was doing that. Plus, I was doing polio. Plus, I never stopped doing polio, but I was also doing that as well. So the point is, when you get to Mark and Olin and Steve, I mean, they have all the details because they were fully involved.
Okay.
All the time, 24 hours a day. And Mark, I'm sure, has a lot of stories.
Immersion. Yes, we will be doing his interview tomorrow.
Oh, okay. Well, tell him sorry I missed him, but he knows what I've been doing.
All right. Well, should we close it for today?
Yeah, I think so.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Dowdle.
Yeah. Don't know that I've helped anyway.
Oh, you certainly have. Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you very much.